presume you can put the lights down a little, can you? Thanks very much, Peter, and I'm delighted to be able to talk to an audience who can at last understand my Scottish Donegal accent. It's really grateful for that. I thought around the twin themes of the meeting this week, Seamus Heaney and the theme of political reform. And I'll deal with political reform towards the end, but Seamus Heaney, of course, just to say a few words, was very much taken in his travels around the Donegal landscape, as you know, and Lochanuir, just to the north of us here, was the inspiration for one of his great poems. And I looked around for some of his quotations, and I found the one, I think, which is very appropriate to what we're talking about this morning, which is at the bottom here. The world where we are to make our tarry ark lies before us. And that's, in a sense, what we're really looking at today, the kind of future world that we want to form, that we want to shape, that we want to leave behind as a legacy for those that come after us. I want to begin with a little graphic which shows the changes in carbon dioxide concentration at various points on the planet, from the South Pole to the North Pole, starting first of all in 1979 and working its way through in this oscillating manner where vegetation grows and dies and takes in and leaves carbon dioxide behind. Much more so in the Northern Hemisphere where we have land than in the Southern Hemisphere where it's mostly ocean. But you can see the inexorable rise which takes place over time as that concentration rises at all of the monitoring points in the world that we have. The red dot is the key one in the Hawaiian Islands, the blue, the South Pole here. And you can see as we work our way through the 80s and into the 90s, how that rise is really inexorable, working its way up from a level in 1980 or so of around about 335 parts per million to eventually today to a value which is over 400 parts per million at the last count. And as we get to 2013, 2014, we ask the question, well, is it a recent event? Is it something that we haven't seen before? We begin to see, incidentally, some of the key stations in the Irish context coming into play. In Macehead in County Galway, for example, here, one of our key monitoring stations. But we see then, as we get to the present, about 400, we can ask the question, well, what about before that time? And we can push back that record, and the graphic will begin to push it back in a second or so, from the very early records made by Teeling in the Hawaiian Islands, way back from the geophysical year of 1957. And you can see the green line now pushing those records back even further, and they go back to the early 1950s, and you can see how that recent rise is not something new, it's something that's been going on. And something that even when we monitor it effectively, we can see has occurred for the past half-century or more. But we can push it back even further by looking at bubbles in our ice sheets. We see how it settles down at a level of about 280 parts per million before the Industrial Revolution. And that is therefore a dramatic change from then to the 400 parts per million of today. And going back even further, we can see all the way back from earlier records from the South Polar ice sheets, how that concentration moved a little up and down during glacial and interglacial times. But as we go back through time, 80,000 years before the present, 200,000 years before the present, you can see the changes, low during the ice ages, slightly higher during the interglacial periods, but all of the time, all the way back to 800,000 years before the present, never approaching the levels at which we're at today. And that tells us that something strange has happened to the global climate system in terms of what we're putting into the atmosphere. In terms of what's causing it, we have finally a very authoritative report, which Laura referred to, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I don't want to go into the details of just how much this represents the scientific consensus at the moment, because it's just so overwhelming. The IPCC collects all of the key scientific people working in atmospherics throughout the world, looks at their research, establishes where it's going, establishes where we are, and produces very authoritative reports every 7 years. And those reports are extensively reviewed. They're extensively authored by all the leading people, and they're signed off on by all 195 governments which comprise the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So there is no more definitive statement on where we are and where we're going than the IPCC reports, the fifth of which we've now seen over the past year being published in various stages. So what do they tell us? Well, they tell us, first of all, as we know, that the world is warming. It's warmed by just under a degree or so in the past century. And we know that each of the decades of the past 4 decades has been warmer than the decade before. We know also that probably in this part of the world, in the Northern Hemisphere, we experienced over the past 30 years probably the warmest 30-year period of the last 1.5 millennia at least. So we are facing something that's quite exceptional. Now, it has slowed down a slight bit in the last decade or so, and some people have jumped on this to say that global warming is not happening or it's a myth. And I think that's very misleading, and I would urge you to discount those kinds of stories, because the trend is very clear. And with a trend like this, there will be noise and there will be oscillations. And obviously, you can cherry-pick the period you start, a shorter-term analysis, and you can, without any trend, you can find things which might well suggest to you that something is different than it really is. So be very careful about what you read in terms of some of these stories of global warming having ceased, slowed or stopped. It certainly has not, and we know the reason for the slightly less fast rise of the past decade, but rest assured it's keeping going. The IPCC also are adamant as to what's causing the changes in temperature. If we look at the observed changes, they're largely explained by the greenhouse gases and largely explained by the anthropogenic component in the greenhouse gases, not the natural ones. So things like solar activity, volcanic activity, internal variability in the Earth system. Yes, there's a lot of uncertainty, but we know that they're not significant contributors on the scale of greenhouse gases. And likewise, as we clean up particles in the atmosphere, if anything, we're adding to the warming effect. So here's the headline statement: extremely likely. By that, the IPCC mean with a 95 to 100% certainty that the warming of the past half-century is human-induced. Now, that's the same kind of level of certainty as the medical profession would tell you that smoking causes cancer. So we mustn't underestimate the conclusion here. And, of course, the driver is what we're putting into the atmosphere in terms of extra carbon each year. We're currently dumping 10,000 million tonnes of carbon into the atmosphere. We've about doubled what we used to dump in even as recently as 30 years ago. And in 30 years' time, if we continue on this trajectory, then we'll be roughly doubling again. So that's the warning signal. If we've already had this effect, what will this mean in the next 30 years or so? And the IPCC suggests that if we do continue on that trajectory, then we face a 50-50 chance of a 4-degree warmer world by the end of the century. Now, that is quite a serious conclusion, which Laura has already alluded to. But there's one other, and of course associated with warming, which we often associate the headlines with. The most important part for many countries is actually the changes in rainfall which will accompany it. Desiccation of many parts of the developing countries of the world. Too much rain in places where they already have plenty of rain in some cases as well. So we have to think also in terms of food supply, in terms of rainfall changes as being just as important as the temperature change is concerned. Nature is telling us that these things are underway. If we look at where, for example, our summer sea ice changes are taking place, the IPCC now tell us that we're putting, as a result of melting ice, both from the land and the sea, but mainly from the land, we're putting about 215,000 million tonnes of water into the oceans each year, from the effects of Greenland beginning to melt around the edges. Now, it will take centuries for Greenland to melt, but there's still a contribution which is significant. And now, increasingly, we recognise that Antarctica, far from being stable, is actually also releasing large amounts of water to the global system, 150,000 million tonnes of water a year. It's up from about 30 as recently as the past decade or so. So dramatic changes taking place. This is the picture today, in fact yesterday, in the Northern Hemisphere. Within a couple of weeks, maybe about a month, you'll be able to sail from Donegal to Japan, around North Siberia. You'll be able to sail unimpeded around the Northeast Passage, and many tankers and ore carriers are gearing themselves up to do that this summer. You may even be able to sail, as you could a couple of years ago, through the fabled Northwest Passage along the coast of northern Canada. Such has been the shrinkage in Arctic sea ice. And at the moment, we're trundling along here, as of 2 days ago, a couple of standard deviations below the 30-year average, close to, if you like, the record lows we reached a year or two ago, and maybe we'll even exceed them by September when the minimum is reached. And as Laura was saying, as a result of these kinds of conclusions from the IPCC, sea level estimates have been increased again. They were coming down for a long time, but now we expect somewhere up to almost a metre of sea level rise by the end of this century. And it's not something which will stop. Even if we were to get our act together today, sea level will continue to rise for several centuries, up to 3 metres, in fact, over the next century or two. So that's an ongoing problem. But here's the thing I really want to tell you today, because it's the most, I think, dramatic conclusion of the IPCC, and that is that for the first time, a good relationship has been established between the amount of carbon historically we put into the atmosphere and the temperature rise associated with that. And that cumulative amount of carbon, because after all it lingers in the atmosphere for 100 years or more, that cumulative amount of carbon, which has given rise to 1 degree almost, is about just under 500 million tonnes of carbon. So we can draw a relationship. What will happen if we continue along the present track? And certainly if we do continue along the present track, we expect that 2,000 billion tonnes of carbon would produce a temperature rise of about 4 degrees. But if we want to stabilise climate at 2 degrees, that dangerous climate change threshold which Laura referred to, which internationally we're signed up to, we need to limit the amount of cumulative carbon to just under 800 million tonnes. Now, we've already put in 535 of those historically. So this is what we're left with for humanity to play with to avoid dangerous climate change, 235 billion tonnes. Now, at the moment, we're dumping almost 10 billion tonnes in every year. And if you divide this into this, it tells you how many years have we got left. So we have between 2 and 3 decades left to get our act together, because once we use that up, we have therefore entered dangerous climate change inevitably. So we have 2 decades. Now, what does that mean? It means that every child, and you maybe have grandchildren or children, who is born today, has only, by the time they leave secondary school, if we continue on the present track, will have no way of avoiding dangerous climate change. Every 18-year-old, 20-year-old child will face a world with few options in terms of avoiding that 2-degree threshold at which we don't know what happens to Greenland, we don't know what happens to the Gulf Stream, we don't know what happens in Antarctica. And that's the urgency of the problem that we face. 2 decades of decarbonisation. And the sooner we start, the better, because we can start early and have a rather more relaxed way of tackling the problem, or we can face the cliff if we delay too long. And therefore, there is a climate cliff, just like there is a fiscal cliff. If we ignore it, if we put it into the future, if we kick the ball down the road, then we face a rather more acute problem. And that will manifest itself in a number of ways, and I don't have to tell you in Donegal how it manifested itself in terms of extremes this winter. We can't attribute an individual winter, of course, to climate change, but we can say that the frequency and the probability of events like this, which we experienced during the winter, are likely to become more common and more problematical. We're not sure how we will affect the upper air determining factors on storm activity in the jet stream, but we know that it has a tendency for locking at the moment. It got locked in position for this whole winter, giving rise to the unfortunate coincidence of events that we had this winter, where we had depressions arriving at the same time as storm surges, high tides, and also a background of sea level, making the effects rather more serious than they would have. So we had an extreme. We had roughly, if you like, in February, over the whole winter, in fact, we had roughly 846 millimetres of rainfall in the southwest of Ireland, not too far off double the average winter total. In February, you may remember, in Ireland we had 23 days with gales, we had 3 days with storms, and one hurricane event as well. So those kind of extremes are not new. We've had a run of them in Ireland. You may remember at this time last year, the warm, hot summer. You may remember the fodder crisis of spring, the bitterly cold spring. You may remember the wettest summer on record in 2012. You may remember the record cold spells also in the winters a few years back. Extremes are how climate change will manifest itself first. The modelling we've done at Maynooth suggests that many parts of Ireland will undergo quite significant temperature changes over the next few decades, but also very significant rainfall changes, especially in the east of the country in summer, where it will become drier, and the west, where it will become wetter in winter. So those kinds of things that we've become accustomed to in winter, the flood events, will become more of a problem. The kind of things that we haven't become accustomed to, managing water during dry summers, will become more of an issue as well, as we try and figure out how to control our infrastructure and plan ahead for the stressful times. And the things that we take for granted in our landscape, the things which depend on moist, waterlogged conditions, our bogs, our mahair, our turloughs, those kinds of environments will become more threatened, as our carbon stores also are not being very well managed, as you can see from this slide at the moment as well. Again, short-term leading to long-term problems. And species which are associated with threatened ecosystems will become more threatened as well. And in many cases, these are part of our psyche. Do you want your grandchildren to ask you, what was the cry of the curlew like? What was the snipe like? Where are the bogs that used to cover Ireland gone? Those are the kinds of issues that we have to face, and even we have to face the opposite, invasive species, which we don't really want in Ireland, also coming in at the same time. Now, adapting to climate change, as Laura said, is a very complex thing. We may have to adapt how we build our structures to cope with changes in driving rain. We may have to adapt where we put our septic tanks as water tables in winter rise. We may have to adapt also where we construct infrastructure and not make mistakes in the short term, which will be very costly for those that come after us if we have to start relocating huge infrastructural projects, and indeed our people. Many of our people live quite close to sea level. Peter mentioned the problem of the Dublin docks, but we can now use GIS to work out how many addresses there are at particular heights above sea level. And if you take a particular county like Dublin, we know that there are something like 10 or 11,000 addresses at 2 metres above present sea level. We can do that for any county. We can actually say, well, if they were flooded, how much would it cost? And we can use insurance claim data to work out the cost of flooding at a particular level. So if we take 2 metres, the national cost quickly goes up well over €1.5 billion. If we take 3 metres, 2 billion. And if you take a county like Donegal, which is not really one which is going to be affected very seriously, you can see even there, we have several million euros worth of exposure potentially. So because of that, the EU are taking steps to control emissions, to try and get countries to play ball. And many countries are undergoing very constructive and very effective control measures on their emissions. As much as 42% reduction well underway in Scotland, that target being well targeted at the moment. In the UK, generally 35%. Even countries like Russia are undertaking quite elaborate carbon reduction programmes. Alas, we are increasing our carbon emissions again. We have begun to increase even though our obligations tell us, as Laura said, we have to come down by 20%. And we will be exceeding the agreements we've signed up to within a couple of years, with potential cost for you, the taxpayer. It will be you that foots the bill for us not getting the act together at a national level. And the reason for that is, well, our biggest increase has been in agriculture. We have a plan for intensification of Irish agriculture, which involves dramatic increases, 50% increase in milk, 20% increase in beef production, 50% increase in pig production. Even with the best will in the world, it's hard to see how that can be achieved without major emission increases, especially in methane. And of course, we tend in Ireland to keep transparency in some of these issues less than would be considered desirable. So Food Harvest 2020 avoided a strategic environmental assessment, a statutory one, on the grounds that it was originally a food industry initiative rather than a government or a Department of Agriculture initiative. So the actual figures we haven't got as much as we would like. We do estimate from the EPA work it's going to be at least 9.5%, which may be a conservative figure given this kind of scale of increase. And the other thing, of course, we tend to do is we try to get the rules changed in Europe to suit us. And this is the last and the latest episode of that story. So we've seen a retreat from climate change legislation. Minister Coveney said in 2011 it wasn't a priority. And indeed, it still isn't a priority. We still haven't got legislation on the books. And we're not going to have legislation which has specific sectoral targets in it, which again is a serious omission in many people's minds. And we're going to look for the rules to be changed in Europe again to suit us. So when the public was asked for the public submissions on the bill, when you were asked, this is what you said you would like to see in legislation. You would like to see targets, both at national and sectoral level. You would like to see emission reduction roadmaps to precede any sort of sectoral kinds of roadmaps being produced, but which would act as a straitjacket for sectoral roadmaps. You would like to see an indicative long-term target of 80% by 2050, as Laura was saying, is important on a global scale, with reporting on a regular basis and with an independent advisory body to take it out of politics as much as possible. You didn't actually get that. Of the 13 recommendations from the Climate Change Committee, the Oireachtas Committee considering that bill, the Minister accepted only 8 of them. No targets, no definition of what was meant by low carbon, vague definition, and a weakening of the Independent Advisory Board came out as well. Now, some of these, you might take issue with, but they do reflect very powerful vested interest groups who have influenced strongly the course of legislation. So who are the winners and who are the losers? Well, in the non-tradable sector, that's the non-industrial sector controlled by Europe, we find that the aspiration is that energy will be decarbonised by 2050. We find that transport will be decarbonised by 2050. Now, that's quite a significant project if you think a little about it. We find that houses will not be emitting any fossil fuel burned emissions by 2050. So where is it all going? It's all going to agriculture. 100% of non-tradable emissions will be earmarked for the agricultural sector. That means that there's a large inequality, to my way of thinking, in how the ordinary taxpayer will be treated, the ordinary resident, the ordinary energy consumer. That's not to say some good work is not being done. And the local authorities, I think we have to commend firstly, because they are moving ahead in their development plans in a way that national government is not. And many of them have been very progressive in incorporating climate change issues into their development plans. But finally then, to finish, and to address the second theme of this particular meeting, I think it's quite clear that the political appetite to tackle climate change has been lacking. The leadership necessary to take head on the vested interest groups has been lacking. And I think the light touch regulation, which has been the theme of the past decade, Well, we've seen what that has as an effect in other areas of the economy, and I think we have to question its suitability here. We shouldn't underestimate the parallels between the fiscal crisis and the climate crisis. They are, I think, very much on the same magnitude. Thirdly, in terms of our institutions, domestically, I think I would conclude that the Department of the Environment, Community and Local Government is not a sufficiently powerful department to tackle the bringing together of powerful departments like agriculture, transport and energy in climate change policy. And I think it's time to question whether it might not be wise to take responsibility out of the Department of the Environment and put it into the one department which can bang heads together, namely the Department of the Taoiseach. That's not to say individuals in environment are not good individuals working really hard, but I think in the pecking order of government, it simply doesn't have the clout to achieve what's necessary. And I think the failure of successive national climate change programmes has really demonstrated that. Thirdly, I think the policy of sheltering behind intransigent countries like Poland, even like Germany in its car industry negotiations, I think is something to be regretted, and I think we can't really accept that very much longer. So, while there is some hope in the Climate Change and Low Carbon Development Bill, I think now is the time to strengthen it. Now is the time to put into it the ingredients that were missing in terms of its independence and in terms of its ability to take this whole area out of politics, out of the electoral cycle of politics in particular. And it's very important, finally, because the Taoiseach hopefully will go to the Ban Ki-moon summit, which Laura mentioned in September. And Ban Ki-moon has specifically asked, bring to the summit bold pledges, innovate and scale up, cooperate in concrete action. What will Ireland bring to the table on that occasion? One has to finish by asking, because, as I said at the very beginning, the window of opportunity for us is closing, and really we have to act at the present. Act now. Thank you.